As a gamer, you have a few choices when it comes to what processor to choose for your gaming rig. And while we looked at the 5800X3D and 7800X3D recently to see what kind of value is behind both CPUs, I wanted to kind of up it a notch by pitting the 5800X3D against the humble 7700X, a CPU that is faster but lacks the 3D V-cache. And in typical eTeknix style, we've thrown them through 42 games to see if the extra $40 that the 5800X3D commands is worth sticking with an older platform for. Or could you save some money by getting the 7700X and still getting some top tier gaming performance? But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits for my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. So I don't want to spend the whole video going over specs because both processors have been out for quite some time, but I do want to quickly go over the main differences because each CPU, while good in its own right, are actually very different. The 5800X3D, for instance, comes in with a 3.4 GHz base clock and 4.5 GHz boost clock, while the 7700X comes in at 4.5 GHz as a base clock and 5.4 on the boost. So naturally, you'd expect that the faster CPU can outperform the slower one. Normally that would be the case, but then when you drill down into the whopping 92 megabytes of L3 cache that the 5800X3D packs over the somewhat paltry 32 megabytes on the 7700X, that's where the playing field gets leveled somewhat. Now, I won't pretend that cache beats speed or speed beats cache, but the 5800X3D was a huge step up over its non-X3D counterparts. But today is a little bit different because we're pitting speed against cache, with a sprinkle of architecture change and IPC improvements thrown into the mix too. And considering that the 5800X3D can be had for $339 and the 7700X for $301, I think there's quite a good argument for either chip, depending on the performance. Now when it comes to games, every title is different and some games only utilise a couple of cores, while others love as many cores as possible. So the fact that both of these CPUs pack 8 cores and 16 threads each doesn't really favour one over the other. But the key point here is that some titles love clock speed, so you'd likely see a large uplift on the 7700X, whereas other games can really harness the potential of the extra and stacked cache that could see the 5800X3D knock one out of the park. And that's why I wanted to test them against each other in 42 games to see overall which is the better buy, especially considering the platform cost should actually be not too dissimilar. Because while the older 5800X3D is more expensive, DDR4 is cheaper, while the 7700X is cheaper, but DDR5 is more expensive. And we'll talk through the costs a little bit later on. Now to test for the 7700X, we use the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master with 32 gig of G.Skill Trident Z5 Neo, 6000 MHz CL30 memory. And for the 5800X3D, we use the Gigabyte X570S Aorus Master with 32 gig of Kingston Fury, 3600 MHz CL16 memory. So both memory kits are geared towards getting the very best performance from each CPU. For all of our testing, we used an Inno3D RTX 4090 iChill X30C to alleviate any bottlenecks, and the latest version of Windows 11 was used, and with the latest drivers. All of the testing data is fresh, so everything is as up to date as it can be, and we will be showing 1080, 1440 and 4K today, but due to the fact we're looking at CPUs, our main focus is going to be on 1080p, because this is where the CPU is working its hardest. We've tested both processors in a total of 42 games and we'll be showing 15 here today, while also looking at the percentage differences between the two in all 42 titles. Though if you do want to see the individual data for all 42 games, then we will be putting them up over on our Patreon, where you'll also get a ton of other cool and exclusive benefits, as well as helping to support everything we do on the channel. So with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. Starting with A Plague Tale Requiem, and here we see the 7700X is off to a good start. It manages to come in with 4% more performance than the 5800X 3D, which for a cheaper product is pretty nice to see. 1440p sees the two CPUs falling just a single frame per second apart, so really you could argue that the performance is identical. And the same goes for 4K, where the average frame rates are actually identical now. Now what is worth noting is that the 5800X 3D at both 1440p and 4K does have slightly better 1% lows. Next up is Assassin's Creed Valhalla, where at 1080p the 7700X now sits below the 5800X 3D by a small margin of just 1%, which is so close that you could realistically say it was the same, and given how high these frame rates are, you won't notice the difference anyway. 1440p remains the same and we see no real difference in performance as the two CPUs maintain the margin of error difference. 4K is also what we'd expect, where the GPU starts to take over and we see the two processors sitting pretty much identically, separated by only a single FPS. So all in all here, the CPUs are pretty evenly matched. Baldur's Gate 3 is next, and this game really manages to see a huge advantage when using the 3D Vcache CPU, with the 5800X 3D sitting a pretty sizable 17% ahead in performance at 1080p, whilst this gap widens at 1440p to 24%. 4K is again much closer, with a difference in frame rate of 5%, which is still above margin of error, but it's not enough to really worry about. So if you had the cheaper processor, you wouldn't really be missing out on much performance here. Moving over to Call of Duty, we see the 7700X take a lead at 1080p of 6%, but with that the 1% low FPS does fall a little lower than the 5800X 3D, but not by enough to worry about, so it's still a win in my books. 1440p and 4K are both seeing pretty much the same performance, which seems to be turning into a bit of a pattern, though it is expected as the nature of these CPUs are pretty equal at the higher resolutions. With that in mind, the 7700X does manage to be a single frame better at 1440p in the averages and the 1% lows, but really no one would be able to pick up on that anyway, so it's kind of a pointless win if you could call it a win at all. Our next game is Counter-Strike 2, and we do see some pretty weird behaviour here, but this could be to do with the way that the GPU is being utilised, as we mentioned in our last video. Regardless, we do see the 7700X managing to push out 6% more performance on average at 1080p, with 4K following in these footsteps and seeing the same 6% difference. 1440p however has the CPUs neck and neck with less than 1% separating them, but to be honest, the frame rates we see across the board here are already so high that I really don't think anyone will care what the CPU manages to achieve, as the game will pretty much always perform well. We're taking a trip to Night City for our next game with Cyberpunk 2077, and here we're seeing more of what we were hoping for. The newer CPU outperforming the older CPU, and at 1080p that gap in frame rate sits at a decent 10%. Then 1440p does see performance drop a bit as you'd expect, but only for the 7700X, as the 5800X 3D actually goes up in frame rate by a single FPS, so margin of error. Despite that, the 7700X does still sit ahead, this time by a margin of error of 3%, which isn't great, but it's still something. 4K is once again identical, but the 1% low frame rates do fall apart somewhat, with the 7700X managing a smoother 51 FPS compared to the 5800X 3D's 46 FPS, which is a difference of 10%, which would make for a much smoother feeling game. Of course, it would be remiss of me not to point out that at lower frame rates like this, the percentage will look artificially inflated somewhat, so take it with a small pinch of salt. Turning on ray tracing does see our performance fall as you'd expect, but not actually by that much, and now the two CPUs perform 8% different from each other, with the lead being taken by the newer and faster 7000 series CPU. The 1% lows are actually a lot further apart this time though, with 20% between them, and the 5800X 3D only just scrapes by the 60 FPS point. Yes, it does fall under that, but only by 1 FPS, so I'll forgive it. Then we have the 7700X, which is comfortably over 70 FPS in the lows, and means that you'll have a much more consistently smooth experience on the newer CPU. 1440p and 4K are once again pretty much the same, with small differences in the average FPS and 1% low. But of note is that the 7700X does sit just that little bit ahead at both of these resolutions, so there's still some benefit to choosing that CPU for this game. Next up is F123, and here we're seeing very high frame rates from both CPUs, but the 7700X does see higher with 10% more frames in the 1080p averages. At 1440p, the 5800X 3D doesn't see a drop in performance, whilst the 7700X does. This isn't enough to see a major change though, as the 7000 series CPU is still the better performing, but now by a slightly smaller margin of 8%. Then there's 4K, where both processors again perform pretty much identically, separated by just 2 FPS. And in this game, the frame rates were already stupidly high, so this will just serve to make the difference even harder to spot. Far Cry 6 is next, and here we see the 7700X performing very well with better frame rates at all resolutions. At 1080p, this improvement is at its largest with a whopping 17% more FPS on average, and with better 1% lows to boot. Then at 1440p, the difference does narrow as you'd expect, but it doesn't change all that much, and is now a slightly less impressive 14% better. But it's still nothing to complain about, so there is that. 4K also sees a drop as expected, and it's our smallest difference by far, but at 12% I'm still not going to complain, as that extra performance comes at a lower cost. So that's a win-win situation if I ever saw one. Hogwarts Legacy is a bit of an odd one, as we see the CPUs trade places and back again as we move through the resolutions. At 1080p, the extra 3D V-cache clearly makes a difference, with the 5800X3D coming in 5% faster. That win is short-lived though, as the faster 7700X makes up for the loss at 1080p with a 13% lead over the 5800X3D at 1440p, and seemingly with much better 1% lows too. Then at 4K, things draw much closer together with a margin of error win to the 7700X of 2%, but again with stronger 1% lows. Moving on to Spider-Man Remastered, where we see some weird results to start with. Both 1080 and 4K are seeing identical performance in the averages, with the only difference coming by the way of a 3% lead that the 7700X has in the 1080p 1% low figure. 1440p is where we see some differences, and that comes by the way of a 4% variance in performance in favour of the 5800X3D. To explain these figures, it's evident that even with high-end gaming parts like these, at 1080p we are limited by the CPUs, and at 4K we're limited by the GPU. Enabling ray tracing pretty much fixes our issues, and now the 7700X is outperforming the 5800X3D in every instance. 1080p and 1440p both have the 7700X performing 18% better than the 5000 series CPU, whilst 4K has a smaller, but still impressive, 11% more frames per second on average. So for whatever reason, turning ray tracing on managed to get the 7700X to really stretch its legs, as the limitations are somewhat removed from the equation. Flight Sim is well known for bringing PCs to their knees, with the only saving grace you can have coming by way of frame generation and 3D V-cache, which means that the 5800X3D is consistently ahead in this game, though we are talking a margin of error increase going up through the resolutions, with 1080p and 1440p seeing 3% more FPS and 4K seeing 5% more, so slightly higher than margin of error. And while it isn't all too much, it is something. And as this game has always been a tough one to test, as it's very picky with hardware, it does show that using a 5800X3D is kind of a best case scenario for it, and does feel a little unfair. But that's the point of this comparison, and it does provide us with a good look at the situations in which the older CPU could still be a better option for you. Moving on to Remnant II, and at 1080p, the 7700X manages to perform a hefty 17% better on average, with 1440p narrowing that gap quite a bit to just 6%. While 4K comes in with, again, almost identical performance, as is expected. For less money though, it's really hard to argue with this kind of performance difference, as, well, you're spending less for more, which everyone loves. Finally, we have Watch Dogs Legion, and this is a bit of an anticlimactic end, as there really isn't much I can say, as the performance is within a single frame difference in the averages of every resolution. So, if nothing else, at least you have comfort in knowing that the 7700X is the better value processor for this game. Even though the averages were pretty much the same, we did actually see the 1% lows have some slight differences. Not by much, granted, but a few frames here and there is always nice, and it's worth pointing out that the 7700X is the better performing in this aspect at every resolution, even if it is just through margin of error. So some interesting results, and nothing too out of the ordinary for what was expected. You have to remember that both CPUs have some pretty strong merits. The 5800X3D is a chip with 3D V-cache, which, depending on the game, can really make a difference, while the 7700X is significantly faster in terms of clock speed, and a lot of games will just love that extra bandwidth, which results in higher frame rates. Now, to get a better idea as to who wins on this one, we have to look at all 42 titles and how each CPU did. So, when looking at the percentage differences, it's clear to see that for the majority of the games, they did favour the faster 7700X. In fact, this led to an overall average coming in 6% faster than the 5800X3D. What's interesting is that while over half of the games came in faster on the newer 7000 series CPU, the X3D did still have its wins, with the largest gains coming by way of Baldur's Gate 3 at 15% and Hunt Showdown at 13%. Beyond that, there are some smaller wins ranging from between 1 to 7%, and some titles like Red Dead Redemption 2 and Spider-Man coming in with identical performance, so we really are at the limits with each CPU on those. In terms of the 7700X, the biggest win came by way of Dirt 5 at 26% and Redfall at 22%, which is pretty expected due to their fast-paced nature, therefore preferring faster clock speeds. Now, what we found during our 15 tests is that the 1% low figures can actually make up some of the difference as well, especially where the results in the averages were much closer. And it's here where the 7700X came in 10% faster overall. Again, the 5800X3D did have its wins in the likes of Control with ray tracing at 10%, and again Baldur's Gate 3 and Hunt Showdown both at 9%. The biggest win for the 7700X came by way of Hogwarts Legacy with RT enabled, where the Zen 4 CPU came in 33% faster, which is quite a large jump that could also be quite noticeable. There's some other high differences when we look at Spider-Man with ray tracing enabled, Doom Eternal and Dirt 5 all coming in 27% faster, and then it starts to taper down somewhat. So performance aside, slightly, the big thing with these processors comes down to the cost. One is cheaper than the other, and when factoring in the performance between them, we find that at 1080p, the 7700X being the cheaper of the two does affect the cost per frame, with a pretty decent $1.34 per frame, compared to the 5800X3D's $1.59 per frame. So cheaper processor, more performance to the tune of 5%. And this results in a lower cost per frame of just under 16%. Now, as we move up in resolution, this of course sees the CPUs draw closer, and even though the 5800X3D handles the higher resolutions better, it's not enough kind of at 1440p to really offer up any better value for money, as it comes in 6 cents more expensive per frame. And then at 4K we end up with identical cost per frame at $2.39, though the 5800X3D does come in with 13% more performance overall. So spend more, get more in the sense of raw performance. But when looking at value, well, they're identical. Now, when it comes to costs and comparing apples to apples with these two processors, we have to look at the total platform cost, because one uses DDR4 and the other uses DDR5. DDR5 is typically more expensive, and DDR4, along with a compatible motherboard, is essentially cheaper, even if in this case the processor is more expensive. So to see how that balances things out, the cost for the 5800X3D as a platform, so CPU, memory and motherboard, we're looking at $339 for the CPU, $140 for the DDR4 memory that we used, and the motherboard at $169, so a shade under $650. While the 7700X comes in at $301, the DDR5 memory comes in at $156, and the equivalent B650 motherboard at $230. And that means that we're taking the total platform cost at $687. So we're talking $37 more for 6% extra performance. This means, when you break it down, for 6% more money, you're getting 6% more performance. So you could argue that it is bang on the money. Now, of course, it does mean spending more and not necessarily getting more in terms of an uplift, but you are getting a way of future-proofing your system beyond what a Zen 3 based system will give you. And for the sake of less than $40, I'd honestly say that it's worth it. So, what have we actually shown here today? Well, I think it's evident that both choices, whether it be the 5800X3D or the 7700X, are wise choices when it comes to gaming, and are able to rival each other in very different ways depending on the games that you play. Now, when it comes to value for money, there isn't really much to talk about. They are identical, and really the argument comes down to if you have that little bit of extra cash to spend to get higher performance in a raw numbers view, but to also get that longevity of the platform as well, which I honestly think is well worth the extra cost. Zen 3 has, to a degree, had its day, and with new CPUs from AMD touted for a launch this year, prices will tumble anyway. So it may even be best to wait it out a little bit longer, depending on how quickly you want your shiny new system. The other aspect is for those who may already be on Zen 3, which may just involve an upgrade of the CPU instead of a complete platform change. And that could make, well, the world of difference. What will be interesting is to see what the future holds in terms of games. Will they be geared and developed more for utilising cache, or will it be clock speed? Or will AMD find an improved way of incorporating a bit of both, which the 7800X3D was on the right track to do, but at a higher level? I think the new generation of processors will definitely see a decent uplift, but I don't think it will mean that the 5800X3D is ready to hang up its kind of gloves yet and retire, because what we showed today is that, well, the old girl's still got some life left in her. So yeah, that's going to do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then you can help support us over on Patreon, where you'll get a ton of really cool benefits, including exclusive behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, access to all of the charts individually, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.